the world's #1 international journalist and correspondent on Gaza, Palestine, and the real face of journalism, the distinguished Harry Fear. They are losing this war with Hamas. What do you make of the tunnel networks of Hamas? This is a question that I haven't seen any Israeli asking.
This was never about Hamas. And you and I always knew that, but a lot of the public didn't know that. It was about exterminating, as I like to say, Adam and Eve of Palestine.
Why does ICJ not call it genocide when it is happening? Why do they always delay it after it happens? Yeah.
The IDF is obviously conducting a program of terror on the Palestinian civilians and the Palestinian population of Gaza. It's obvious. Everyone can see that. Everyone would agree with that. Everyone can see who are the real terrorists. But so long as the serious language of foreign policy still aligns and allies with Israel and gives plausible deniability to
who can govern Gaza afterward?
Thing which is even run by Palestinians, and that could be genuine representation, or it could be Palestinian stooges.
What red lines can be set for Gaza by the Arab countries or even other countries?
The Egyptian army has been doing the dirty work, really, for the Israelis in terms of maintaining the siege and the situation in North Sinai.
An extreme honor and a privilege to get to speak to one of my inspirations. And I would like to introduce you first. Professionally speaking, you are a British journalist and filmmaker who has spent extensive time in Gaza since 2012. But I would like to introduce you in my own way. You know, there are very few people in this world who are exceptionally talented across various disciplines. In your case, a great journalist, a correspondent, an activist, an academic, a researcher, an analyst, a motivational speaker, a coder, a filmmaker, a storyteller, and now a technologist. So very few people in this world who are exceptionally talented across various disciplines. And there are even fewer people in this world among the multi-talented class who invest all their talents not for soulless corporate capitalist system, but for truth and justice. And there are extremely rare people in this world among the multi-talented class who invest all their talents for truth and justice with such conviction and bravery. And among those extremely rare people in an era of dishonest journalism is none other than a hero journalist, a savior of journalism, whose analysis on Gaza was far ahead of its time, the world's #1 international journalist and correspondent on Gaza, Palestine, and the real face of journalism, the distinguished Harry Fear. Assalamu alaikum, sir, and how are you doing?
Walaikum salam. Thank you very much for a definitely overly generous introduction.
I read all about you, and you know, I think it's an honest on my part. It's an honest introduction on my part. So we'll move on to the question and answers now. We'll dive into the question and answers. You know, you have been the most experienced foreign correspondent in Gaza. You have seen it all from Operation Cast Lead to Pillars of Cloud to Protective Edge. Can you explain some of the stories of the pain and suffering in Gaza? How can we describe the pain and suffering of people, especially those suffering and suffocating and getting crushed under the rubble during this genocide?
Yeah. I first went to Gaza in 2012, and the second time I was there, I ended up by chance being there during what was called a war, one of these periodic bombing campaigns, one in a long history of such, one in a long history of the decades-long conflict, not just the 2 decades-long besiegement and bombing of Gaza. And I went at a time when, due to the political conditions in Egypt, it was finally possible to somehow break the blockade in a small way and enter Gaza, and not just be there to open up symbolically some sort of international solidarity to break the informational siege in a sense, or to break the human siege, but to try and depict some of what was going on in a besieged territory that was very much starved of international media attention. And so, for example, I made reports on the ground. One gentleman had his marital home struck by a drone strike. And that was so unextraordinary, this guy's home and life being blown up by a drone strike, that it barely touched reportage even in Gaza, in the Arabic media, let alone in the international media. And in that context of a desert of attention, I wanted to put myself there as a human and journalistic act, and to do humble efforts to try and redress the informational desert. So I ended up being there during 2012 and during 2014. And the last time I was there was in 2017, so a long time ago now. And of course, what's left of Gaza now, it's a different place. The only thing that remains is the people and the spirit of resistance. But everything that was a practical familiarity has been literally blown to smithereens. And I know people who've been killed during the genocide, know people who've been killed during the Great March of Return and in previous bouts of violence. But I think the world is seeing, even those absolutely unversed in the Gaza situation or the Israel-Palestine conflict, or even unversed in any kind of sense of the reality of the borders of the Middle East and the conflicts there, how the people of Gaza have been patiently enduring a horror. And it might be culminating now in something that I would say most people, most of the world would accept as a genocide. But it's that resistance and indefatigability which marked my experience of meeting Palestinians in Gaza, something which really speaks to reality at the almost metaphysical or spiritual and very base human level. That is really the Palestinian story, because you can apply horrors of torture, kidnap, arrest, destruction of home, destruction of university, systematic brutality and execution of the talented class or the most qualified in Palestinian society in Gaza. But what you can't remove is the very deeply rooted, I like to think of it, kind of Adam and Eve of Gaza. That is to say that you can't remove the absolute firm rooted, deep rooted will to survive and not to give up, that is so manifest there, and I think has made its way into people's hearts around the world during this time, this last almost 2 years now of genocide. So that is the real story. Having said that, an important qualification is that no people deserve such a test. And although in some way it's beautifying and inspiring to see people survive without giving up, without being broken down, to massively simplify, no people should have to go through that. And the moral injury that we all face in an insane world, with the climate crisis, with this genocide crisis, with so many other crises that all interlink, speaks to our powerlessness as individuals at times, or the sense of powerlessness. And that, unfortunately, is part of the power dynamic of these maniacal and genocidal forces that we see unleash.
Yeah, and your documentary was Gaza Still Alive. It was a very powerful documentary in which you covered all the stories of the Gazans. Um, what do you make of the current situation now? Almost 2 years have passed as of October 2023. What are the chances of a sustainable ceasefire?
I don't believe that Israel has any interest in a ceasefire. And I think that is not just to analyze the power dynamic and the interests of the players at hand, but I think it's becoming pretty evident that that kind of reading is going to hold, because we saw over the last few days reports from the Israeli media sphere saying that the government position is we're not interested in a ceasefire. And we see further to that Donald Trump suggesting that he's going to sort of weigh in behind Benjamin Netanyahu in terms of the domestic Israeli political corruption saga. And so, unfortunately, I think that bookend to this ongoing situation is unlikely to materialize soon, meaning that one of Israel's preferred outcomes on the spectrum of outcomes is likely to hold. That is to say that a continued ongoing occupation of what's left of the territory, continued strangulation of the population into those pens, these mini concentration camps around three main population centers, so that Gaza represents a alternative reality to the West Bank, where there are Bantustans with the division of the apartheid wall, but in Gaza, something much more like a dystopian movie, where civilians are penned between fences and white tented encampments and scramble for food in what is you can only describe as a Hunger Games like scenario.
Yeah. And next question is, to what extent are these humanitarian organizations like UNRWA, UNICEF, and World Food Program still able to deliver food, water, and shelter to the civilians in Gaza under current conditions?
My understanding is that they have had their supplies completely exhausted, which has allowed Israel, who has maintained this symmetrically sealed blockade around Gaza, to exploit the opportunity to effectively get UNRWA out. And the reason why is this is fairly well known. It's part of a long-term power play by Israel, a long-term goal to weaken the Palestinian position by undermining this UN institution that, in its very existence, affirms the Palestinians' right to return. And that is to say also the Palestinian diaspora to an extent. And by uprooting it from the Gaza situation, it also effectively removes it as a de facto player on the Palestinian scene to further undermine the Palestinian negotiating position when it comes to these kinds of concepts like the right of return for the diaspora. But even if Israel were able to further displace Palestinians in the foreseeable, it may be able to also attack their ability to return. So undermining the Palestinian position by removing UNRWA is a long-term goal. There's also, of course, the practical element, which is that UNRWA has provided healthcare relief in terms of food and education. And by removing this, you attack the Palestinian ability to exist in Gaza, to survive. And it's managed to not only do that, but to do it with a hard pivot to the dystopian extreme, which is this basically military contractor that runs the current setup, where we see these almost daily massacres of Palestinians in as what I said, like Hunger Game-like scenarios. And that is incredible that in summer 2025, we've ended up in a situation where Israel has been able to effectively take over the aid dynamic and enact what is a very negative outcome for the Palestinians in Gaza, where it is basically empowering chaos, not just at the humanitarian level in terms of food scarcity, but also empowering the gangs, the looters, no doubt the drug dealers, and the kind of the warlords of the Gaza territory, in order to effectively make the Palestinian population there easier to divide, more ungovernable, and effectively more desperate from the point of view of civilian survival, but also any kind of political organization or any kind of civil administration. So by attacking it with this sort of cancerous chaos, you're attacking the Palestinians' ability to organize, to survive, and to resist in any organized, even political way. So it's a stark mark of where we're at that Israel has been able to achieve that.
Yeah, and we have just witnessing these days the images of how aid has been weaponized, and
Mm.
all throughout these days, all these reports are coming up of firing, Israel firing during Palestinians are getting this aid, right?
Mm. Yeah, and of course, it's also American military contractors who are on the ground. I've even seen evidence that there's British citizen military contractors on the ground. And it speaks to the kind of, don't want to say invisible complicity, but the absolute blatant complicity of the Western powers, who on the one hand, we have this political or geopolitical diplomatic sphere where they say the situation is terrible, but in practical, brutal reality, the arms supplies continue, the intelligence sharing continues, the private contractors are still able to go, and in the American case, actually sending all of the weapons very actively to the tunes of billions of dollars, and supporting the Israelis in every way. So it really destroys reality for all of us in the sense that people are in a situation where effectively you sort of can't trust what our leaders say because they literally sort of barefaced lie in terms of their exceptionalizing of the situation, whereas at the same time they are allowing it to continue. And I think that in a lot of cases they actually don't consciously know that they're allowing it to continue. I think that they've really internalized that there is this sort of nuanced position that they can take. But I believe at night they must be kept awake by the situation. But I believe during the day, these leaders, these foreign ministers, these Middle East ministers, I believe that during the day, they really somehow believe that they have struck this genius, nuanced position where they can call out what's happening, but at the same time, completely allow it to continue.
Yeah, but the world hasn't accepted it, right? Because this is the first time where the world has united and complete complete 180-degree reality on what is happening on the ground and what their ministers say.
Yeah.
Complete 180 degree. How many Palestinians do you think have been killed in Gaza? I mean, there are various reports. What are the best estimates? A recent report revealed that 377,000 have been found missing. Are Gaza Health
Mm.
Ministry figures underreported?
My understanding is that the 400,000 figure, if I can call it that, was based on some Israeli analysis, which itself had an academic error in it, which has since been corrected. And my understanding is that the best statistical approach so far has rendered the figure of something like 110,000 Palestinians killed or martyred since the beginning of the October 8th genocide 2023. It is a killing machine. Israel has managed to set up a killing machine. And in 2023 into 2024, all of these governments allowing Israel to do it by saying they have the right to self-defense, knowing quite well, I think, that they were effectively greenlighting the beginning of this extermination program. No one who has a cursory sense of Gaza would think that it's Disneyland Paris. What goes on there is basically survival and death. And by greenlighting Israel in this way, by repeating the self-defense mantra, I believe they knew what they were allowing to happen, actually. I don't believe that there was any sort of plausible deniability for them. And I think the way that it has broken in chapters is the obvious extreme use of force, the marshalling of civilians to different areas and then bombing them again and bombing them as they're on the route, and then they're in a safe zone and they're bombed in the safe zone, and then they're bombed when they're collecting aid, the systematic destruction of all of the buffer areas, the systematic destruction of all of the civilization, the universities, hospitals, all of these things. I believe these general markers of the genocide program have penetrated people's consciousness. But I think the shocking thing is it was the deliberate besieging this year which finally marked a turning point for a lot of the sort of liberal establishment in the West. It wasn't the systematic annihilation of the Palestinian civilian population or their civilization in Gaza. It was this almost extraordinary, almost technicality, really, that starving is in a league of its own to just outright decapitating babies with airstrikes. A bit like we saw with the crazy situation with chemical weapons in Syria. It's sort of this method of killing is absolutely unacceptable to us, but everything else is fine. And I think that in itself, and that kind of shorthand street analysis, even that has made it into the popular consciousness of populations worldwide. And so we now have this moment of high awareness and moment of sort of impunity for Israel, and we see its allies somehow reproached from their position, but still reproaching themselves in a way which is incremental and at this stage still fairly marginal. But at the same time, we shouldn't lose the symbolic importance of all of the wins that there have been. But it's a crazy time to be alive.
Yeah. A recent Dutch newspaper revealed that many genocide scholars called this a genocide, including Dr. Melanie O'Brien, who is the president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars. And after this, even people like Piers Morgan started calling it a genocide. So what do you make of this? And I would like to add that why does ICJ not call it genocide when it is happening? Why do they always delay it after it happens? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the destination is genocide. The intention was set at the beginning as genocide, and if they carry on like this, they will successfully terminate life in Gaza. So the destination is definitely genocide. The intent and destination is genocide. How fast or slowly they decide to try and do it is almost a technical question. They, according to the situation with Iran or whatever, flares up within the political scene of various other powers like the US domestic political scene, they're able to ramp up their annihilation program and then tone it down again according to the level of international outcry. With regard to calling a spade and the legal sphere, it's understandable that the international courts take time to make their decisions. And in a world where no one from any objective outside bodies can access Gaza, it's also understandable that it's difficult for them to come up with a rushed position. However, it's not really relevant because anyone can see that it is a genocide or it's an attempt at genocide. So what matters is the sort of injunction of the Genocide Convention and the obligations it renders on other third parties, not the Palestinians and Israelis, but other third parties. And it's that which is shocking. And it's that which has been abandoned in the sense that, for example, the UK seems incredibly to actually suggest that genocide isn't taking place and to actually strike that position in court to avoid all of the repercussions that there would be if the UK was explicitly understanding that it's supporting effectively, indirectly or directly a genocide. But it's the Genocide Convention that puts obligations on other third parties. And, we live in a world where, wins in terms of this setup, the political wins for the Palestinians in Gaza are symbolic things like the Maldives, blocks Israeli tourism in an act of defiance. We see small symbolic wins in this sense, whereas what we should be seeing is European governments that usually proclaim to be very much rooted in international laws that they help build, or write, would immediately understand that they're complicit or potentially complicit in a genocide and cut off ties with Israel and try and sanction it in the way that they would Russia or Iran. But we live in a topsy-turvy, upside-down world of double standards, and it's incredible that these serious people are holding out as long as possible that they can to do anything under these obligations. But I think, and I'm sure that we all agree as watchers of the conflict that they're starting to be genuinely afraid that a reckoning might come for them. If not legally, then certainly politically.
Yeah. Yeah, and I often observe that there are these panic attacks in Western media every day. Yeah, and you know the
Yeah.
genocide scholars, the main argument they posed was that because you know 90, I think more than 90% residential buildings have been destroyed. So they are saying that it is going towards making situation unlivable and uninhabitable. So this will happen. So that's why they are foreseeing it and calling it a genocide now. The genocide
Yeah,
scholars.
I think it's already past that threshold. I think it's already past that threshold. They've already systematically killed off a lot of the Palestinians in terms of a brain drain, going after everything from Olympians to artists to scholars. They've gone and taken out all of the universities and as best as they can, the hospitals, and then they've destroyed as many of the housing units as they can. And they've gone about fighting Hamas in a way that causes maximum destruction. Whether or not they even themselves believe that they have plausible deniability anymore, I think is doubtful. I think that Israel has got to the stage now where it has really like a rabid dog. It's become a demented rabid dog. It no longer has any internal logic, even by its own standards of normalized hatred and racism and an addiction to violence to solve all problems, an addiction to domination to solve all problems. I think it has, in the way it's acted, gone about its invoking its slow destruction because to speak to the deeper level, if you produce that much violence and chaos in the world, it will come back to bite you. And I think that we're starting to see that for the Israeli case.
Yeah, and what do you make of all the continuous ceasefire violations by Israel? You know, there was a ceasefire deal in January, and there were, I think, three phases. And in phase one, it was that Hamas would release majority of hostages, and they released it. And in phase two, Hamas was to release all hostages. And before the, I think phase two started, they, you know, started this ceasefire violations. And from March onwards, every second or third day, I think Israel is now bombing Gaza. So what do you make of all these continuous ceasefire violations by Israel?
The violations of ceasefire has been a norm for more than a decade. Israel will break the ceasefires whenever it wants. And the more powerless any military resistance forces are in Gaza, the more easily it can just break the ceasefire and it has no real effect for Israel. Israel has managed to put its boot on Gaza in a way that is worse than I could have imagined back in winter 2023, 2024. And the depths of its barbarity and the normalization of the same it is just unfathomable, really. And if we talk about a medium-term ceasefire or there being a ceasefire in the summer of 2025, I personally don't see it. With Trump still in office, with Netanyahu gaining some international support, as I mentioned earlier, with the Iran theater now being opened up, the analysis on the street being that what we saw in terms of the Israel-US aggressive bombings on Iran was just to loosen Iran up for a more protracted conflict of ongoing destabilizing of Iran. I think that Netanyahu will be able to expand his chaos campaign to allow him to stay in office longer. And Gaza will not only be backgrounded from time to time as a result of those other adventures, but that the ongoing situation in Gaza can be turned into something which feels perpetual and that it can be normalized. And we may see some alleviations in certain elements. For example, in the siege of the aid, and perhaps allowing in some of the international bodies. But at the moment, Israel has managed to stay in a maximal position in terms of maximal brutality and achieving a lot of its goals, apart from expulsion of the Palestinians to the Sinai. And it's got a long way there's a long way it can go in terms of concessions, in order to try and relinquish some of that international pressure, short of the whole thing blowing up in its face. So I don't think we'll see a ceasefire very soon, unfortunately, given the current political setup.
Yeah, and a question from the other side, moving to Hamas. I think a question that their side should be asking is that, we know that Hamas is involved in guerrilla warfare, right? They are under the tunnels, and they, come up and then they start fighting Israelis, and they couldn't do anything because if Israel really wanted to fight them, they would have gone into the tunnels and fought them. But that way it becomes a one-on-one combat, and they don't want to fight this. So that's why they are losing this war with Hamas. What do you make of the tunnel networks of Hamas? This is a question that I haven't seen any Israeli asking, and I think this is the question that they should be asking if they really want to, challenge Hamas. Yeah.
Yeah. The tunnel system isn't talked about much in Gaza. And so I have only a fairly superficial sense of it, from sort of on the ground sourcing. But my understanding of it since October 2023, upon researching it in terms of sort of open source information, is that it's the ultimate nightmare for Israel because it can't easily flood the tunnel system. It, as you mentioned eloquently, is reticent to go into the tunnel system. And it can't just openly bomb all of Gaza from the air in terms of like carpet bombing it. So it is the ultimate nightmare. And so by denying the guerrilla warfare contact, as you described, the one-on-one, Israel will never be able to militarily defeat Hamas and the other military groups. And it knows that. And that's why effectively it's just a war of terror on Palestinian civilians in Gaza that it's left with. And however many fighters it kills, or supposed fighters it kills, there will always be to put it again in these strange terms, a military Adam and Eve. That is to say that if there's an Adam and Eve of Gaza that is the spirit of Palestinian resistance, generally there will always be an Adam and Eve that's also willing to fight militarily. And so you can't get rid of any resistance. And so this goal that was to destroy Hamas basically means an infinite war on the Palestinian people. That is to say, in another way, an ongoing infinite program of genocide and extermination. So yes, the tunnel network as a means of laying the groundwork for a military conflict isn't exclusive to the Gaza territory, and it is the ultimate nightmare for a fighting force that's reticent to lose its soldiers. And even in spite of the technological advances, using dogs, all of these sorts of things, there isn't any military easy answer for Israel. And looking at it from that point of view, from the military point of view, the underground tunnel network is almost irrelevant. They will just bomb whatever they want to bomb whenever they want to bomb it. I think that's become fairly clear now for the world.
Yeah, and their language is sort of Nazi-like, but there is slightly different because they use the word existential threat. These people are existential threat, but this is sort of different because that when the Nazis use it, they use it like it was against this race. We are fighting against this race, but they are using it like we are after Hamas, but they are killing all the civilians anyway. They're slightly different language, but the purpose is the same.
Yeah, I just want to say to that, I think that the language of the framing that Israel has, understandably after October 7th, in terms of I was going to say victim narrative, but obviously there actually was in that sense a victim narrative after such an event, although even October 7th has complexities that could be worth going into. But the extermination campaign, they haven't really hid it very well. And even the hatred, the racism, they don't hide it very well. And it really takes only a cursory understanding or a cursory look at Israeli Hebrew language media to see that the hatred and the intents at extermination or extermination are there. And the fact that the English language international media has for these now, 3 calendar years allowed almost a kind of buffer of credibility on the Israeli program of extermination by hiding from the world these real intents, by minimizing them, by insufficiently humanizing the Palestinians. They have really been part of this schema of genocide that has existed to allow for Israel's impunity to exist. So it is hiding the Israeli intents to a large extent, or at least very much minimizing the intents, propping up the victimhood narrative, even though it burned very quickly after October 2023 into November 2023, in terms of it became clear, obviously, by January 2024, that what Israel was doing was no longer a response to October 7th. And then also completely trashing all of the international objective frameworks to look at the situation by never really underlining sufficiently the international legal basis, the genocide convention obligations. It's all been whitewashed. And so the informational sphere that has been present has been like a bad trip for anyone that's watched the conflict. It has completely belied the situation.
Yeah. And next question is that studies reveal that Israel has military control. Yeah, this is an important question. Military control of about 35% of the Gaza Strip, which is referred to as Israel's Gaza buffer zone. Can Israeli settlers move into that region?
I just wonder whether or not we should take a break close to the...
I was asking that, studies reveal that Israel has military control of about 35% of the Gaza Strip, which is referred to as Israel's Gaza buffer zone. Can Israeli settlers move into that region?
I don't think yet Israeli settlers can move into the region in the sense of the realpolitik of Israel or the geopolitics. That is to say, this would be a massive provocation for the Europeans that Israel would regret, in terms of it would massively increase the pressure that European governments were under in order to do something about the situation. I don't think that level of step forward from the Israeli perspective is something that Israel could tolerate in terms of international pressure. And therefore, I don't think, practically know, that it could happen. However, in terms of Israel's military control of Gaza, we have seen a sense of settlement, in the sense that some of the IDF personnel have sort of set up camp in Gaza in what, in a sense, are mini settlements. They're not outposts in the West Bank sense, but they are not just bare military encampments either. And so I suppose that is to say that Israel has been testing the limit of what it can get away with in that sense. Even in the Israeli domestic scene, I don't think that setting up an outpost in the north of Gaza would be workable for Netanyahu. And I don't think that's something that we will see. I think that it's a terrible thing to say, but I think there's a long way to go in terms of Israel's current extermination program before we would see it actively settling parts of Gaza. However, I do see that if Israel is able to normalize this current program of extermination, and it is able to continue with it for much longer, that there may come a point where it will the Israeli regime be able to do some kind of more concrete settlement of Gaza? Yes, I do. I do envisage that. Speaking about the percentage of control, I think Israel has already got what they call, freedom of operation across most of Gaza now. I don't think it's 35%. I think it's the vast majority of the Strip in terms of how much resistance it will face as it goes into different zones. I think the amount of resistance it faces is now substantially reduced, and really so little that it has a lot of freedom of movement across the territory, and it's been able to use the ongoing war as an excuse to create these new arterial roads that will allow it to quickly assert a presence into particular zones by slicing up the Gaza Strip with those military access roads. And the fake humanitarian program that it's set up as well further entrenches that by increasing the footprint that is set up in Gaza. So in this sense, I think the trajectory is to further suffocate the population, to further have it move into ever shrinking population zones, spatial zones. If it's able to continue doing that, maybe with some humanitarian buy-off, that is to say, to allow some, let's say, World Food Program, some accesses, it may then, we may see a situation where parts of the north, for example, are settled by outposts in what's more like a West Bank setup. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. If this war ends, how much time do you think it will take for rebuilding of Gaza? And would Palestinians be able to survive during that time without displacement?
A lot depends on the Trump situation. I think that one hope, to put it in very much inverted commas, was that the Iran aggression would be a quid pro quo against stopping the Gaza genocide. I think it's impossible to make an assessment about whether that is likely to happen because the Trump situation is so unpredictable, as we've seen, deliberately unpredictable, that is impossible to see what the calculation is. Although I think, as I've said, that the evidence of Trump supporting Netanyahu in the Israeli domestic scene with the corruption charge is not a good sign in terms of pressuring Netanyahu to wind up the Gaza genocide. Also, when there is a ceasefire, let's say that it will happen, what it really means in terms of how it will be that much different from what's happening at the moment is another valid question. Because if it just means that the daily bombing of Gaza will be stopped, but Israel is still able to bomb Gaza every week, and still has freedom of operational movement along large swathes of the territory, it will be obviously, yes, a massive buffet against the sort of genocidal program, but it won't feel like that much of a ceasefire in another sense to the civilians in Gaza, because the precarity of living there will still be high. The sense and reality of ongoing threat will still be high. So what I mean is, when I was there, for example, for the first time in 2012, the bombing could happen anytime. You never knew when there was going to be a flare-up in violence. And that was like a honeymoon period in comparison to now, because, of course, now it's hard to even survive in terms of food. So if Israel stops its regular daily bombing, but falls back to a more seasonal bombing, but still maintains a massive besiegement campaign, it won't feel that much different in a sense, comparing the new situation with what Palestinians have been used to for 3 calendar years versus what happened before. And so it really just depends on what that ceasefire means. In terms of the dynamics of the ceasefire, in terms of how it might come about, I don't see how Hamas, looking at sort of objectively at its negotiating strategy and the reality of the situation, how they could possibly agree to a ceasefire at this stage, which doesn't involve a proper Israeli withdrawal. But at the same time, I don't see enough pressure on Israel, given the current sphere, for Israel to feel like it needs to agree to that. And that's why I feel that the ceasefire question at this point is very, very hypothetical. And that's why I do feel that what is the ceasefire and how much of a ceasefire is it is the key question. Because if Israel is able to draw down its operation to something that feels maintainable indefinitely, then there won't need to be a ceasefire. And in many ways, it's not in the Israeli interests to have a ceasefire, like a organized stop to the genocide, because actually having an ongoing conflict serves various strategic goals. So it's a terrible thing to have to say, but I just don't objectively see at present that a ceasefire is going to happen in the next month or two. But obviously, I hope that something changes, perhaps while we've been on this call.
Yeah, because I looked at different times, some say it will take 5 years, the rebuilding process. Some say it will take up to 10 years. So, these are different.
Yeah, completely. If there is a ceasefire, let's say there is some miraculous manifest pressure from the Europeans, led by Spain, let's say, and they decide they're going to go all in against Trump and put diplomatic pressure on. The EU is going to stick its head above the parapet and go all in on calling complicity out and go all in on, let's say, the genocide word and this sort of thing. And let's say Israel is forced to a ceasefire. The rebuilding is going to take decades, as has already been calculated, and cost an unfathomable amount of money. And part of the problem is the destruction zone that has been created is itself toxic. We're not starting in terms of building on foundations of a car park. We're talking on building on a war zone with not only the remnants of human life still buried underneath all of the bombarded buildings, but unexploded ordnance, the water supply, for example, being destroyed. We're basically talking about starting from scratch after clearing up all of the toxic mess. And at that point, if international parties are brought in, which they would be, because Israel's never going to pay for that sort of thing, that's not going to happen in terms of the current Israeli political context situation, that will involve international bodies coming in. But if international bodies are coming in, it's very hard to stop evidence collection for war crimes. They're almost closely linked in practical reality. And so I think that Israel will be very reticent to allow that to happen. At this stage, as I say, it's a terrible thing to say, but I just don't see it happening, to be honest.
Yeah, and what do you make of the October 7th attacks? How much involvement was there from Hamas, Israel, and others?
I think it's a very fair question. I mean, the Al Jazeera investigation shows clearly how a lot of the killing on October 7th was own goal killing by Israel's attacking of anything that moved in the hope of preventing captures of Israeli civilians. The decision to effectively reassign IDF personnel from the Gaza envelope to the West Bank is one of the most striking things, I think, because it speaks to a decision it speaks to an image of arrogance, where Israel thought it could maintain this concentration camp with no major footprint, and it's a fair conspiracy to question whether or not the reassignment of personnel from the Gaza envelope that was sort of protecting it to the West Bank was serving some kind of strategic purpose. The fact that we know from the Israeli media leaks that there was clear knowledge that Hamas was preparing something like this, even imminently before it occurred, October 7th, suggests that there is enough to go on in terms of looking at whether this was a deliberate attempt to create a catastrophic outcome, which could be used as a pretext, whether that is Netanyahu plus two co-conspirators, or whether it's more widespread. We know already about the makeup of the Israeli regime, that a lot of the intelligence apparatus is very much against this kind of ongoing antagonism towards the Palestinians. We know that the former heads of the intelligence agencies are actually very outspoken about the Netanyahu approach to the conflict, which is just to obliterate everything that you can see. So I don't think we're talking about, if there is a conspiracy, a widespread conspiracy. At the same time, I find it somehow hard to believe, and I feel intuitively that it's more a sense of a noose has been hung by the arrogance of Netanyahu. That is to say, that this feeling that Gaza was put to bed and that this starvation and this suffocation of Palestinians for decades could just go on indefinitely. The blindness to the humanity, the dead heart. I feel that that was really the dynamic that that led to the blowback, rather than something deliberate. But I believe, and I agree, that there are definitely reasons why one would want, in an ideal world, to investigate the extent to which that was deliberate. Because we know, even within the mainstream Israeli political sphere, there are people, there are even ministers now, who have an apocalyptic, extremist, fundamentalist, lunatic, maniacal approach to the situation. You know, they would happily nuke Gaza and etc.
Yeah, and it was similar to the 9/11 attack. Yeah, media rushed towards it. They just rushed towards the date and started this obliteration. Yeah. Next question is that what position should be taken on Hamas? What position should be taken on Hamas? UN does not describe them as a terrorist organization, but these Western countries do.
Yeah. I mean, the shorthand answer is that Hamas is not a terrorist organization in the sense that it is a tent that includes a militant group. To essentialize it to just a shorthanded terrorist organization is itself, I would go so far as to say, is racist, because it essentializes the Palestinians down to, you're only allowed to have representation in the form that we tell you. We don't even recognize your political bodies. So in that sense, you could make the claim that the Al-Qassam Brigades is a terrorist group, but I just don't think it's relevant. Even if it was relevant on October 6th, I think it's even less relevant now, because the military dynamic of the conflict has been rendered clear by what's happened over this 2023, 2024, and into 2025, 3 calendar years. It illustrates that this was never about Hamas. And you and I always knew that, but a lot of the public didn't know that. And now they can see that it never was about Hamas. It was about exterminating, as I like to say, Adam and Eve of Palestine. So the other direct answer to your question is simple. That is, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. And as I said earlier, so long as there is a few Palestinians left in Gaza, you will always find someone who is willing to militarily resist their extermination. It's just a human instinct. And so how we categorize Hamas, how we recognize it, etc., I feel is almost irrelevant at this point, in the sense that the only thing we should be recognizing is the word with a capital G, which is genocide. And Israel has in this sense, shot itself in the foot because it has completely exposed that this was never about terrorism, was never about Hamas, that it seeks an extermination. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, in the UK, Hamas is prescribed as a terrorist organization, but I believe, and I would have to check it, but I believe that the actual legislation for that is that it covers the Politburo as well as the Qassam brigades. I would have to check. I'm not too sure about that. But I think in as much as this question is relevant in summer 2025, if we're talking about Palestinian representation, international representation, the question is, does Hamas as a political movement sit at the table? And we see from the PA-led bodies that obviously they have the internal conflict, factional conflict with Hamas. But we hear that no, Hamas is not interested in taking a seat at this time. I honestly think that the current genocide program is like a reset on the whole question of how the Palestinians are represented. I don't mean this in any sense of I think they should be represented in a different way. I just mean to say that what comes out of the other end of this pipeline of extermination may be new actors and new voices from the Palestinian side that we haven't heard before or haven't heard for a long time, whether that be Marwan Barghouti, for example, or in a less good case scenario, it may be some businessmen, Palestinian businessmen with sort of ties to the Israeli regime, for example. So I would imagine that we will see Hamas increasingly backgrounded in that image of Palestinian representation in the coming years. In all honesty, I would imagine so.
Yeah, I asked that why are IDF and Likud not designated as terrorist organizations, and who can designate them as terrorist organizations?
Yeah. I think this speaks to the crazy world we're living in, where if you were to, if I believe you're Pakistani citizen, but or a citizen of Pakistan, I should say, but me as a British citizen, it would be legal for me to go and fight for the IDF and just return to the UK as if I had been on holiday in Italy, which seems incredible. That is the current position of the UK government, effectively. Now, if it wanted to change that, it could quite easily do that. It would just say it would increase the level of legal oversight around the possibility or plausibility of terrorism or war crimes being very much linked with the Gaza war, and it would basically put a stop to dual British Israeli citizens from just going over there and coming back as they like, free will. So if it wanted to do that or start to turn that dial, it could. The fact that it hasn't done so, hasn't even begun to talk about doing so, speaks to this real world green lighting of what's going on in the face of these fake statements saying they're appalled by what's happening. The IDF is obviously conducting a program of terror on the Palestinian civilians and the Palestinian population of Gaza. It's obvious. Everyone can see that. Everyone would agree with that, apart from the most deranged pro-genocide apologists. The Likud party and the Israeli regime do not believe in Palestinian state. They don't believe in Palestinians even existing as a concept in some cases. But at the same time, the powerful Western governments proclaim that Israel is the only Mideast democracy and that it's an ally and it's like us and all of these sorts of things. So it paints an image that is stark, that they are still willing to a very great extent to provide diplomatic and legal cover for Israel. And unfortunately, it's incredible that, for example, the UK is still effectively supplying Israel with fighter jet components. I mean, how is that possible? Yet at the same time, they claim that they have an arms embargo on Israel. At the same time, they're flying the intelligence flight from Cyprus or wherever over Gaza. So there's this double speak. And everyone can see who are the real terrorists. But so long as the serious language of foreign policy still aligns and allies with Israel and gives plausible deniability to Israel, it enjoys this support from its allies, although to a decreasing extent. But the extent to which that support is being withdrawn is so slow, shockingly slow, that we have a lot further to go in terms of manifesting civil pressure and resistance against these governments to get them to comply with the Genocide Convention, for example.
Yeah. And next up, if the ceasefire takes place along with Hamas releasing all the captives, who can govern Gaza afterward?
Yeah, if a ceasefire happens, I think there are sort of three sort of scenarios. The first is similar to what we have now, and we've seen that Israel has been trying to empower sort of looting gangs and clan leaders to sow the seeds of chaos. So that's one scenario, as I mentioned, where instead of Gaza as it was a few years ago, governed by one authority, Hamas, for better or for worse, and it was responsible for the civilian control, law and order, asterisk. For Israel, it would be, in some ways, if you wanted to go all in on a divide and rule and chaos strategy, and to make the situation very much unlivable for Palestinians, even more precarious and insecure, you would want maximum chaos, which is gangs, clan leaders having particular zones that they fought over, which you could then have many exploitation points to support and to seed to entrench the chaos. So that's one scenario, which I think is likely to be on the palette of options that Israel would choose. The second is to have a sort of military technocratic situation where you, for example, we've got the Gaza Relief Foundation or whatever it's called, where military contractors are brought in to deliver this sort of civilian amenities, asterisk. But if that were to be extended throughout the Strip, and then to allow some limited international presence, maybe for education, you would end up with a high level of military occupation and what is sort of a drip of kind of humanitarian assistance. So that would be the kind of the maximalist military occupation option. Or the other third option, as I imagine it, is much more like the West Bank, where we see, if not the PA itself, but like a kind of competitor to the PA setup, and that could be something which is even run by Palestinians, and that could be genuine representation, or it could be Palestinian stooges. And I mentioned earlier that it could be that Israel would pluck one or two Palestinian businessmen that it thought was pliable to its pressure and say, look at these guys, they're going to run the show now. A bit like in Iran, we have the great grandson of the Shah coming up and saying, I'm going to seek to take over Iran, this kind of thing. So I think those are the kinds of options that we might see.
Next question. Can Gaza be seen as an experiment zone for the West Bank? Meaning, if Israel succeeds in, carrying out this, genocide in this area, will they, apply the same model in West Bank, Jenin, these areas?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see that. And we've seen how Israel has expanded what they call military pressure, in other words, extermination campaign on Palestinians in the West Bank, with eyes on Gaza, you can quite easily up-level the velocity of violence in the West Bank, but because it's eclipsed by Gaza, you get away with it to a large extent. The ripping up of roads, the bombing of parts of the West Bank. In that sense, yes, Gaza can be seen as an experiment zone for the West Bank, or that is to say, the West Bank can easily become like Gaza much more quickly than we may believe or think. I daren't even go into the thought process of fully building out that argument, because it becomes visible to me that if Israel is able to normalize Gaza in its current way, that is to say, an ongoing occupation, a war that never ends, a perpetual war, then by all accounts, it could extend it to the West Bank. And make the occupation in the West Bank not just one that is in your face as it is now, but is one that is much more heavily militarized and brutal. But I don't even want to talk about that, not wanting to manifest it in any way. But I can imagine, I can begin to see that in the very worst case scenario, yes, Gaza could be a template for a new West Bank engagement for the Israeli regime.
Yeah, and other questions could be after West Bank, they have these greater Israeli projects and all these kind of things. My next question is, what red lines can be set for Gaza by the Arab countries or even other countries? I mean, even Joe Biden came up with a red line that, hey, you cannot invade Rafah. And after Netanyahu invaded Rafah, Biden, became against him. He called him an effing liar and, all these kind of things. So why are not Arab countries or coming up with a red line for Gaza? I mean, cannot they intercept Israeli fighter jets? I mean, even in Pakistan, there are, we have those fighter jets that can intercept Israeli fighter jets as well, and many other countries can do that. So why are they not setting a red line for it? Cannot they intercept Israeli fighter jets and their, fighter jet tanks, etc.?
I agree. It's like every red line that is set is just considered to be a red tape to cut by Netanyahu. It appears almost bloody-minded, in the sense that everything should be normalized, every atrocity should be normalized, and it's a "I will get away with it" mentality. And so any red line that's set has to be broken. In terms of why countries are not standing up for the Palestinians, with the exception of Iran, let's say, a lot of because you spoke about it, a lot of the Arab countries are either puppets for the Americans to massively simplify it, or they themselves have some kind of direct ties with the Israelis, or the Israelis have some kind of influence or control that means that the regimes that we're speaking of are so precarious that their survival is predicated on some kind of compliance with Israeli demands. And I mean, that requires a whole different podcast and investigation. But even the Egyptian case, in this sense, Egypt is not an independent country. It has allowed, I'm not talking about since October 2023, but going over the last 10 years, has allowed Israel to use its airspace to bomb in the name of the Palestinian, repressing the Palestinians. But this is meant to be a country, Egypt, that has a peace treaty with Israel that just keeps the peace. That's the image that you have, the most populous Arab country was at war with Israel, but now has this peace agreement, concessions were made, and all the rest of it. But at the same time, in reality, the Egyptian army has been doing the dirty work really for the Israelis in terms of maintaining the siege and the situation in North Sinai, but then also allowing the Israelis to use their airspace. So this concept that the Egyptian nation is that independent from Israel is an illusion, really. It's not a nice thing to have to say or admit, but Israel's web of influence and control is actually much greater than we may initially see or think. And we say Israel's siege on Gaza, but it is Israel and Egypt's siege on Gaza for almost 2 decades. So I hope that answers the question. All of these voices speaking out against the Israeli slaughter, they all have their own air forces, they all have their own armies. Why does no one do anything? Why did the Turks not do something? And we even hear exclamations from backbenchers in the UK, even conservative Tory backbenchers saying, why don't we send a flotilla to Gaza? We have a base, sovereign bases in Cyprus, which is just a couple of clicks away, from Gaza. But no one will do anything because the layers of fear of the Israeli lobby, of fear of the American paymasters, is so great that in many ways, we have a world where sort of no one has the courage to do anything, and it's almost like no one is willing to call the bluff. And even the Arab nations struggle to manifest any meaningful response. And I think that with the Abraham Accords, and I know that the genocide has paused the normalization with the Saudis, but the Saudi Trump White House ties are very strong. And I don't think that anyone can objectively say that, for example, the Saudis have the best interests of the Palestinians at heart. It's just realpolitik, I think.
Yeah. And you have previously mentioned about that it's probably a psychological war, right? It's more of a psychological war. And, some analysts talk about, it's about the stakes, right? What stakes are you, willing to put to this region, right? This is the main question, because Iran showed it to Israel and they stopped. So countries like Russia and China, they are also pro-Palestine. So you rightly mentioned, if there is that courage and if there is that, because Israel and America, I was just reading, they have this concept of doomsday deal, doomsday concept. You have to. So if you give the same amount of psychology, they can stop. Yeah.
Yeah, but it only required, just to counteract that, and I agree with everything you said, but it only requires a couple of acts of resistance for a sense of momentum in the opposite direction. And if there's a sense of the sort of the tide turning, although, of course, the UN Security Council is still controlled by Israel's allies or Israel's paymasters, that we can see a sea change, maybe faster than we think.
Yeah. There's just one last question, one final question, that many talk about the calls to end the war. Should there be a call for collective compensation against Israel and its allies for the collective punishment instead of only asking to end the war?
Exactly. What we're talking about is truth, reconciliation,
and reparations.
Yeah.
That's what we're talking about. Truth, reconciliation, and reparations. In a just world, yes, we should have reparations. Israel, it's often said by analysts that Israel couldn't do this if the Americans or if Trump ultimately objected to it and was willing to turn off the arms supplies, for example. I'm not sure to what extent that is true. I think Israel wouldn't last 10 years without the US support. But it may be able to continue like a mad, rabid dog for 5 years without American support. But let's imagine a world in which Israel has successfully become the Israeli apartheid, just like the South African apartheid image was rendered. I think we're pretty much already there in terms of the international popular consensus. That is to say that I think global populations see that for what it is. But it's a matter of now fulfilling that in terms of the representation in countries. And that's why we see increasing repression. For example, Palestine Action in the UK now being poised just in this upcoming few days to be treated like a terrorist organization, which is a protest group. That is where the next front line will be, because if a whole set of generations have seen the light on the Israel-Palestine true dynamic, the next move will be to withdraw support for Israel by pressuring the governments, and eventually withdrawing the political acquiescence. And it's not too long before the truth and reconciliation comes. In terms of the compensation, in a just world, we would have reparations. Let's see. We've got a long way to go still. But certainly, the situation has never been more ripe for manifesting that pressure on governments, because they have ended up supporting Israel at a time where they have made themselves complicit in a genocide, and they have ignored the Genocide Convention. And again, I keep focusing on the UK political frontline because that's one of the spaces I watch the most. But the proposal by Jeremy Corbyn MP to have a public inquiry, I believe it's a public inquiry is the formulation, into complicity on the Israel question, is absolutely directly the kind of next intervention that will cause a change in the UK. Because if you can effectively set a fire under Sir Keir Starmer's behind, that he is actively worried that his government will be found to be in breach of international law by the UK courts because of complicity, or not, or failing to meet obligations to prevent genocide from all it can do from the UK side. That is exactly the kind of thing where we could suddenly see a rapid change in terms of dominoes fall in Europe against Israel. I hope I've made that clear, to mix far too many metaphors in one response. But if we were to see pressure on the UK government to properly feel the heat of the Genocide Convention, if it were to change its position and say we've been forced to do this and we regret it and all the sort of political language we would hear, we then may see dominoes fall with other European countries. The other thing to watch is the France-Saudi Arabia conference with respect to Palestinian state recognition. That's another tract, although I have somehow less hope about it, but that's another key tract to watch this summer.
Yeah, and many are talking about these signs. All these signs are, signs of an empire collapsing. And many are talking about the reckoning will come. Thank you so much for your time. And, I would like to conclude it, the conclusion that in this
Sure.
era where there is so much dishonesty in journalism and many other institutions, the lines between good and bad are becoming blurry. I've listened to many of your talks where there have been many statements that are quite powerful, your TED Talks especially. I'll quote one of them to end this. Your message to the good people in this world to remain steadfast in good. And I quote, if you start becoming successful, people may accuse you of being selfish or having ulterior motives. But you got to continue being productive anyway. If you identify your own unique personal genius and fulfill it, some will be jealous, but you have to continue fulfilling yours anyways. The good you do today might be forgotten tomorrow, but do good anyways. It'll somehow live on. It has been a pleasure, sir.
Thank you. The pleasure was all mine.